And good afternoon and welcome to DojoLIVE, connecting with experts like you. My name is Carlos Ponce and I'm joining you from Nearsoft's temporary office, namely my home, because 60 plus of us are broadcasting from home today, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, but in Mexico City. And co-hosting with me is my fellow Nearsoftian, Janet Amaya. She's in our offices in Chihuahua. Hi, Janet.
Hi, everyone.
Cool. Okay, this is going to be the first interview of season 4. We're kind of starting season 4, and we're going to be discussing the topic adapting and pivoting in tech with Justin Martin. He is the CTO of a company called FundRx. FundRx is funds and develops high impact healthcare life science startups, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and he also this is all done while pursuing novel research and exploring new models of care. So thank you, Justin, for being here with us today, and welcome to the very first talk and interview of season 4 in DojoLIVE. Thank you for being here with us today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Carlos.
Absolutely, it's our pleasure. So Justin, let's usually what I do is at first I simply ask one single question, which is, you chose the topic, let's see, about pivoting in tech, right? So tell me, why did you choose this particular topic? What intrigued you about the tech world that made you think, I'm going to talk about this? Let's start with that.
I think that the biggest reason I picked it is because it's very topical. It's something that I've been encountering more and more as my career has gone on, where both new technical challenges and business requirements will shift in unexpected ways, and what we build today might not be used or necessary tomorrow. And it comes up frequently enough, and there's not a good enough answer on how to solve the problem that I spend a lot of time thinking about it. So I thought maybe I would spend some time thinking about it with all of you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justin. Okay, and I'm sure that there's a lot of questions based on this particular topic, and there are a lot of questions that are starting to pop into my head right now, but I'm sure Janet has her own share of good questions. So Janet, let's start with you, please. So I know you're going to ask the really cool questions, so you're going to go ahead and do that. And Janet, the mic is all yours. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Sure, I have a couple of questions. I would like to start with a pretty simple one, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be the base of this topic. Justin, as we all know, tech environment is in general is constantly changing. What do you think we can do better? What we can do in order to keep up to date and be able to adapt as required? I mean, any advice you can have for us, like reading tech blogs or magazine or so?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it is a constant challenge, especially with the information overload and the number of things that are happening in the tech world every day. It's too much to keep up with for any individual. So a few things that I do kind of on a daily routine is there's a number of people I follow on Twitter who most of my Twitter feed is now composed of people who post infrequently, but when they do post, it's meaningful. I had to do a recent purge of my Twitter feed and Medium feed of a lot of the noise. So I try and cultivate and curate my Twitter feed as one of the news sources, but then the most frequent source I get is Hacker News and a couple of Medium blogs. A forum where interesting and important issues automatically get bubbled up, I have found to be the most consistently relevant. And so I read a handful of the articles of the day, and I have a few Twitter people that I usually follow, and then the remainder is just from going to meetups and going to group gatherings of developers. the quickest and surest way for me to figure out all the new and interesting stuff that's going on is by meeting new people who are also in tech. Overlapping the bubbles of kind of knowledge is usually the most effective way.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Justin. Okay. So Janet, if I may, I'd like to step in with one question. Of course, my question, as you know, is not really technical in nature, but still I think it's relevant. What would you say, Justin, that are the, how can I say this? I'm trying to word my thoughts. Please bear with me. What would you say that there the market forces, so to speak, are that are most likely to drive or force tech entrepreneurs in the next few years to do as you suggest? To pivot,
make sure,
to adapt.
What are the market forces that will act as a forcing function to have people change their companies and technology in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes, exactly.
The two biggest come to no, the two biggest that come to mind do so kind of powerfully. That the two technologies that I'm seeing emerge that seem to be most relevant and will likely have the largest impact in the next 5 to 10 years are both blockchains and the developments of AI. Almost every company in tech will likely have to make some changes if they want to keep up with the market space in AI. I mean, there's now so many open source tools and technologies available to anyone that there's almost certainly going to be ways to improve one's product or the user experience using some form of AI, or, neural network, or even just a similar machine learning algorithm. But also then blockchains, which have sort of been exploding in the last, mostly this year, but over the last 3 or 4 years since the kind of foundation of Ethereum. That space is quickly growing, and it's becoming more and more apparent that there are use cases all over the web, and some people are saying that this is sort of like a Web 3.0. It's the evolution of the internet. That might be a little bit grandiose, but it might not be, and it's likely to cause a significant number of businesses and tech firms to pay attention to it and perhaps begin integrating these technologies into their platform and products, almost without a doubt.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that was a very good answer. So, Jenny, go back to formulating one question but still, I need you to go ahead and jump right now. Janet, can you hear us?
Yes, I can now. Sorry, I got frozen for a minute.
That's all right. So, Janet, go ahead and shoot.
Yeah, I have one more question. How can you decide, Justin, what's the best option when you are moving to a different technology? What will be the factors to take in consideration before doing it? Because, there's a lot of options out there. So how can you decide what's the best option?
Okay, it's a really hard question. I don't know that I'm qualified to give an answer that's concrete, but a few things that I do when making these decisions is, primarily if it's interesting, it's probably going to get your team really excited about it, and you're likely to get really excited about it. But unfortunately, most of the time, the really interesting stuff is not the right stuff. So I try not to use what's really interesting as a metric to decide whether or not it's the right tool or framework or technology to integrate. What I almost always consider is there a way that I can validate this quickly? If I'm going to try and integrate some new technology that's going to take 6 months before I can see any results, I'm almost always going to say, no, that's probably not the right fit. I need something where I can get feedback to know that it's either working or will work in a short amount of time, or within a week. If for example, I'm considering, right now, platform I'm working with FundRx is in Ruby on Rails, and we're using a previous version of Rails. We're not on Rails 5 yet. And Rails 5 came out a handful of months ago, and it's its full form, and now we could upgrade. And if I'm making the decision, hey, is it going to be worthwhile to upgrade and stay at the latest on Rails, the only way it would be worthwhile is if, one, there were great new features on it that we couldn't live without, which is not the case. Or two, we could do it and find out whether it's going to work within a handful of hours a day. If we can confirm that it'll be worthwhile, then I would give it a shot, as long as that's a short timeline. Another thing is how readily is this new technology or software being supported? Most of the time when you're thinking about moving to some new technology, it's newer, it's cooler, and there's all this hype around it. Or maybe it's a really good fit for the problems and the use cases that you have for it. But if there's not much of a community around it, if there's not a lot of support, if their engineering team working behind it or for the tool hasn't done any work in the last 3 to 5 months, that's a red flag to me. To adopt a new technology, it either has to be really, really good fit, or there has to be a good support community. There has to be other people asking questions, so that when I ask a question, there's going to be people there ready to respond, or someone's already asked that question and there's an answer ready for me. It's when you're working in a production environment and launching new updates to your site once a week, once a day, you can't allow any feature to be delayed a week or 2 weeks waiting for the original developers to respond. So I definitely consider, what's the support like? What's the engineering resource like? Is there a way for me to confirm whether or not this will work in a very short amount of time? And then ultimately it just comes down to, is this going to improve your technology, your team, or your product? If it's a 10%, it's probably not worth it. There's probably features that you can do, but is it going to make it 50 times better? Then I would strongly consider it. And those are, and I know it's kind of a whimsical answer, but those are some of the things that I consider when we're trying to figure out if new technology is worth really adopting.
Awesome. Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, the last thing you just mentioned, it's supposed to be my last question, because yes, it's pretty important. When we have already decided what will be the new technology and we are living the process of the adapting process, what should we do to have the good results if we don't have an expert available all the time during the change? As you mentioned the example of there's no enough community yet or so. So yeah. Right,
and that's a particularly difficult thing. If you can't get expert feedback, then you have to become the expert yourself. And if there is a member of your team or a group of them who are really excited about some new technology, and you've already validated that it'll be it'll provide a lot of new value to your company or to product that you're working on, then usually the easiest thing to get started is you don't begin implementing right away. You begin you create what's called sort of a guild, a group of engineers and maybe product or designers that get together and they discuss it. It's almost like a book club, for lack of a better comparison, where people get together, they talk about this new technology. One or two of them do a play project, they experiment working on it together. And then, after a couple of weeks, hopefully there's a consensus that, yes, this is usable. Yes, we know enough about how to use it that we can do it without screwing things up in a massive way. And yes, we're still excited to use it after we've tried it out. The risk that I try and avoid is being the first to implement the new technology in a production site when I know that I could probably get half the benefit or 80% of the benefit using existing technologies. It's a big risk, especially when you have limited developer resources.
Yes, it is.
So we try and avoid that when possible.
Yeah, thanks for that. Carlos?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. So, Justin, I'm gonna, well, first of all, I'd just like to step in for a minute, and I'd like to remind the audience that if you have any questions for Justin, you can send them here on Twitter at DojoLIVE, right here. That's our handle right there. So at DojoLIVE, Send them over. We'll read them back to Justin, and he'll respond here, live, or when we upload this recorded episode, the recording of the episode, to our website. Anyway, so Justin, I think it's needless to say, this is like a cliche, because we all know that technology, software more specifically, is evolving like by the minute. There are a lot of things going on in the technology world, but so is the target consumer's perception on what technology brings to the table, and specifically when it comes to B2C, or business to consumer. Mm-hmm. So, sort of like the chicken and the egg situation, So, how is this? How can I say this dichotomy, or this particular view, viewed by venture capital firms when deciding which companies or startups to support?
Yeah, and it's a very difficult to use that as a metric for whether or not we would invest and try and put. It's kind of a sidestep. So I think let me backpedal and see if I can preface the answer. So, an example of where this was a big challenge in some of my recent history was at Handy. We had a scenario closer to the beginning of the company. So a little bit more previous. Handy was a sort of like the Uber for home services, on-demand home services, cleaning, plumbing, electricians. Open up the mobile app, you order something for tomorrow, and then a provider would come show up at your place, do the work, and then leave, and you guarantee. And it's an interesting service that we provided. And one of the challenges in the space was that the expectations of the consumer market were rapidly changing as other companies in the industry, in the tech industry, were also evolving. So, for example, it was right around the time where people were getting used to Uber. And when you order an Uber, you have a little map that shows, the car is somewhere down the street and it's arriving at your place and it'll be there soon. You get an estimate, you get a map, it's very visual, it's very rewarding. And as Uber and Lyft soon after and several other companies began pushing this feature, people began to expect that level of clarity and visibility into a service. And at Handy, we hadn't integrated that yet. So it became clear that there's a business need to provide further insight to our consumers about where our service providers were. And as a company, we had to adapt in a fairly small amount of time to do this. And so there's a sort of a time horizon that pops up after one or two companies set a precedence in a technology space or in a marketplace for it's ultimately a game-changing feature. There's a time horizon for where the competitors can release competing or roughly equivalent features to try and match and keep up. And it's a very good indicator about the long-term likelihood of a company's success when they can consistently adapt their product and their company to the changing needs of the market and to their competition. And it is an indicator that we pay attention to from the venture capital side to make sure that these guys are able to adapt and change, and also from our internal side when, for example, another company in the venture capital space releases some new technology or new feature. It is a strong indicator, as long as it stays around for a few months, for us to then begin implementing that or sometimes setting the pace. I'm not sure if I've answered the question.
Yes, you have actually. Yeah, and actually that leads me to kind of like the next one, because I believe that, well, a while back you were part of the Groupon team, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit from your experience with Groupon? Can you tell us what's changed, for example, that technology-wise or in general terms, maybe obsolete practices, trends, in other words, what have you been able to witness from your time at Groupon until the present time that you can mention as an example of what adaptation or pivoting is?
Yeah. It's funny because Groupon is, in a sense, a microcosm for a lot of the changes that have happened in the industry over the last 10 years. Groupon, when I joined, it was one of the first websites to a full production website other than Twitter that was implemented on Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails at the time was still fairly new, and people weren't sure if it could scale or if it could really keep up with the pace of the internet. And this was before mobile was also becoming a big factor in the e-commerce space. So what was fascinating about it was Rails evolved with Groupon. And so we got to see this, Rails is just one example of many web frameworks out there, but Rails has grown a significant amount over the last 10 years, over the last 12 years. But in my opinion, Rails is becoming less and less meaningful. So Rails set a standard in a similar way that Groupon set a standard for startups. When Groupon came out, it was the fastest growing company in the history of startups. It hit a $1 billion revenue in around a year, and it was scaling rapidly, hiring like crazy, and really pushing a new marketplace that it had invented. And then a whole bunch of competitors jumped in and started occupying the same space and doing a lot of things better. Rails has gone through that similar evolution where at the beginning it was just a few people, but then it became this web framework that redefined how people did web development. And a giant community came behind it, and it started growing and growing and became this massive now online community and tool. But it's still becoming less and less relevant in the same way I think that Groupon is, because some of the competitors have proven that a lot of the foundation of the framework itself, and for Groupon, the idea of collective activism behind kind of the consumer marketplace, it has become less relevant. And new frameworks like Node have become a lot more popular, and now services like, I guess, I don't actually have any good examples of a service that's sort of come in and replaced Groupon in that sense, but Groupon shifted to what's called Groupon Now, which was changing to the mobile space and doing deals on the spot. It became very clear that that was more important to consumers as mobile took off. And I think all you can really do is not bet the house on any one technology or even vertical. Groupon had the main use and the main value that they had was at first the email subscriber list, but then when it became clear that consumers were switching to mobile, they realized that the email list was no longer relevant, and it was push notifications that were the new and relevant thing. So they switched an enormous amount of development resources to mobile, and we focused on that. We built a great mobile app with a bunch of push notifications. And I think in the coming years, we're going to see another shift into either augmented reality in the kind of consumer marketplace, or sort of a protocol-based system on a blockchain. And Groupon and other products in technology will have to begin to pivot in that same way and not hold on so tightly to what made them a success in the first place. And have to be ready to adapt the new demands of the market and quickly shift the business and the focus and all the engineering resources to what's going to be most valuable in the next couple of years.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Justin. So, Janet, do you have anything else for Justin? I do, but I'll need to ask you first.
Yeah, me too, please. I have a couple of questions. Justin, what do you consider could be the impact if we are constantly moving between technologies? I mean, is this something good? Is something that we should avoid as much as possible? We talked a little bit about this already, but I would like to listen what do you consider are the advantage and disadvantage of being moving constantly between technologies?
Okay, so if I get it, the question is, what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages between switching technologies often?
Right.
Let's see if I can come think of a good example. Okay, yeah. So one really good example is iOS apps were entirely in Objective-C for since kind of the beginning, and over the last 5 or so years, there's been a large switch to Swift, and there's been this debate among iOS developers for some time now. Although I think the jury's in on it, of whether or not they should make the switch. Should we jump right into Swift when it was first version of Swift, and should we start integrating it into our application? And then at the beginning, the advantages were kind of minimal. Most of the reason to switch over was because you wanted to be on the edge.
Mm-hmm.
So initially, there wasn't really too big of an advantage, and that's often the case with new technologies that come out. There's no immediate advantage until there's a larger adoption. But once Swift 2 came out, and Swift had iterated for a while, and now there were all these new benefits to switching your technology over from Objective-C to a purely Swift app. It became very strong kind of use case for switching over. I mean, especially with some of the new features that were being released in the iOS frameworks. They were built for Swift first, and Objective-C as an afternote. And it was when it became more difficult to implement the new technology or the new frameworks in Objective-C than Swift, where it became very clear that it's time to switch. And the advantage was that we were always on the edge. Once we made that switch, any new technology that was coming out for iOS, we'd be on the forefront. We would get it kind of at the lowest cost. The disadvantage was that for a significant amount of time, and I've gone through a couple of projects like this now, it was both Swift and Objective-C, and there's this interim period which often lasts indefinitely, where you're actually using both technologies. And right now for FundRx, we're dealing with something similar with Angular and React, using both at the same time, which isn't necessarily bad. Being in the interim isn't necessarily bad as long as you have a flexible dev shop. But it will ultimately slow you down as you begin supporting the older technology while adopting new things, the newer one like Swift. The disadvantages are almost always that there's going to be a longer than you would have thought period of time where you're supporting both. And it's almost impossible to make the switch all at once.
Yeah.
So there has to, and I know we kind of talked about this a little bit, but there has to be a very strong adoption and use case for doing the switch before you want to jump in. That way, when you are in the interim, where you're in limbo and you're supporting both, adopting the new technology has advantages even in that time period. I think that's really the only, the list of disadvantages could go on if adopting isn't successful, but if you're successfully adopting the new technology, then theoretically you've done the cost benefit analysis and you know that dropping the old one isn't going to hurt you. It's just the switching period.
I see. Thanks for the example. It was really cool answer.
Sure.
Thank you, Janet. Okay, if I may, Justin, can I ask you a question about FundRx?
Sure.
Could you elaborate on just a little bit on what you define or what you think your definition of a new models of care?
Yes, of course. And maybe it'll make sense to backtrack on FundRx a little bit as well. So our main goal for FundRx is to support a lot of these new technologies coming out in healthcare that would otherwise not receive funding or would otherwise not have a team. There's a big problem in healthcare right now, kind of worldwide, especially in the United States, where the the barrier to entry to investing in healthcare technologies is really high because the knowledge gap, the knowledge required to evaluate the viability of some new technology in healthcare, would require an MD, it would require a PhD. A lot of these guys go deep into the weeds with the technology, and it's very difficult to tell whether or not something is scientifically viable. So VCs and angels will hire a panel of experts to evaluate the science and then consider investing. But that whole process is very expensive. So the majority of the time on early stage medical startups, there's this valley of death. Once they privatize, begin to try and make a company that could impact the world at large, they enter what's called the valley of death, where no one wants to fund them because it's too hard to evaluate the technology. So what we're doing is creating a system where we're creating a community and a network of these venture partners, these scientists, experts, and PhDs to evaluate the new healthcare technologies, either new biopharmaceuticals or healthcare IT, new technologies that can be put in place inside of a hospital that will improve their record keeping or the doctor's ability to see more patients in a short amount of time, or even the transportation layer, driving people back and forth between their house and the hospital without having to pay for an ambulance. All of these would be new models that fundamentally change a lot of the problems right now in healthcare. The example that comes to mind is a company called Safe Rides, who went through our platform, and in a nutshell, they're like the Uber for ambulances. Largely meant for repeat visitors to the hospitals who would traditionally have an ambulance come pick them up and drive them to the hospital, which is really expensive. But you can have a certified car with all the medical equipment necessary to safely transport the person, and a non-ambulance that will do it for way less. And that's an entirely new model in the healthcare space. A fairly simple idea that could completely change the way that patients go and visit the hospitals when they're not in an emergency. And that's a new model of care that we're exploring. So things like that. Another example was at another company called Mini Basic. They had constructed a device that would allow for shoulder surgery in a way that would do it for roughly an eighth the cost and equipment and about half the time for the surgery. Just a nice new device, well researched, had several clinical trials. When used, would dramatically increase the likelihood of success for the shoulder surgery, and decrease the cost and the amount of time the doctor spent. And that was kind of changed, or has the capacity to change that particular surgery. So those are two kind of very different examples of new models of care that we're exploring.
I see. Thank you, Justin. And okay, I like to. Actually, I have two more questions, but Janet.
Yeah, I have one more. So
yes.
Okay. So we already talked a little bit about this. When we are moving between technologies, it will take some time to understand and apply effectively the new knowledge. But in the meantime, the product owner, the client can feel like this is taking a long time to implement, right? So, okay, we as developers understand all we need, and it will take some time and it will have a good impact later. But what will be your advice for developers to effectively communicate to non-technical people all the process and the impact it will have?
Yeah, totally. And it's a constant challenge. And the most effective way I've found to do this is through analogy. Usually the reason customers get impatient or where's the result of this work that you've been doing for the last couple of weeks, is because they don't understand necessarily what the developers understand, which is the technical process, and
yeah, right.
How there's a lot of unknowns and often a lot of technical debt. So when these sort of scenarios come up, it's usually a matter of relating back to something that they might be more familiar with, that the client or customer might be a little bit more familiar with. So for example, trying to convince a business manager that we need to spend 1 week where we're not going to release any new features, and the clients aren't going to see anything new, And it's not going to immediately bring in any more revenue, but we still have to do it because we have technical debt. It's a very difficult thing to explain to a business manager. And so you go to analogy. Like, well, imagine if we're a whole bunch of chefs, and this is something my dad's used a few times. You know, we're a bunch of chefs in a restaurant, and we're trying to prepare people's meals as quickly as possible. And the longer we work in there, we keep on dirtying all of the dishes and dirtying all the pans and all the tools and all the knives. Now, you know, everything's used, and in order to make the next person's meal, we have to search through all the dirty dishes to try and find the one knife that's the least dirty, and then we have to wash it before we can even begin cutting and preparing the meal. It just slows all of us down. The only way that we can continue moving forward as a kitchen is to clean up all of our utensils. We have to get a clean kitchen before we can continue providing great food. And usually if there's a strong analogy there, it's possible to convince them that it's a necessary effort. And the same is true when you're convincing them that now is the time. We've got to switch over to using SAS instead of CSS because it'll keep all of our variables, our view variables, much more organized, and we can repeat ourselves less. It's going to have to be the same kind of analogy, same kind of argument where as developers, we are the professionals in the space. It is our job to make sure we have a clean kitchen and the best tools that we can use to prepare people's food. And unless we can do that, we're going to have subpar dinners being served. So the best analogy I can come up with on the spot.
Cool. I love
this. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Janet. And thank you again, Justin. So, Justin, tell me something. And this is the question that I'm going to ask is a little bit less on the technical side, but I think it's inspirational due to the nature of the focus, on tech entrepreneurs specifically. And my question to you is: apparently you went from electrical engineering, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, to software. So, was this a vocational decision or a business decision or both? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. The biggest reason for the switch was I already knew I liked software a lot. Given my dad, Uncle Bob, kind of beat me with a stick as a child to make sure I was doing test-driven development and ensure that I was coding correctly. And so it built in this sort of early passion for software. When I was deciding whether or not to go into CS, computer science in school, or electrical engineering, I already knew enough about software that I could hold my own, but more importantly, I knew nothing about electrical engineering and the foundation upon which CS is built. And that was like, oh, that's so much more interesting. So I dove into that. But after a few years in school and studying this, opportunities were coming my way to advance my career in software. And nothing was coming for advancing my career in electrical engineering. It was becoming clear that one of those industries was changing very, very quickly. And one of them was not changing as quickly. And so, from a career path, I decided that it made more sense for me to altogether abandon the electrical engineering major and focus my attention entirely on software, an industry that was growing quickly and changing faster than people could keep up. That was really interesting to me. I knew there was going to be good opportunities there. So it was mostly a career business decision rather than necessarily a technical interest. Because the stuff that we were doing in electrical engineering was awesome. We were just getting into true transistor analysis and understanding which semiconductors would provide the right throughput at the right level. It's just about to get really interesting. But I ended up making the switch because there was more practical applications in software at the time.
Yeah, and I get to see a lot more people going into software. For example, I want to be an astronaut, and then 10 years from now, oh no, I don't want to be an astronaut. I'm gonna be a software engineer. So I see a lot of that, but I haven't seen as much the other way around. Okay, being a software engineer, and then okay, I'm gonna be a carpenter. I don't want to be a software engineer anymore.
Well, it's better.
Or a doctor, or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. So it's funny because it seems that software engineering has that allure of just retaining people. And there's this motto, Janet, you might recall that those hoodies that we had done, it said, it's short for not doing something that you love or something like that. So a lot of people who get into software engineering and pursue a career in software engineering, they simply stay there for the long run, right? Until something happens. That's amazing, and it's very interesting to witness, at least from my standpoint as a non-engineer. Yeah, I gotta hand it to you. I mean, I haven't seen that in many career paths in my half century of life. I haven't seen that as much. So that was good. So we're approaching the final segment, the final minutes of today's conversation. So Janet, if you have a question for Justin, now's the time.
Yeah, the last time will be about your own experience, Justin. What would you say is the biggest challenge when you are moving between technologies for you?
Yeah, and I think I want to kind of draw a distinction. When I mean adapting, I mean changing, between technologies, and when I say pivoting, I mean the business has changed focus from one possible source of revenue or income or the path to get customers and to another one, and both both provide their own set of unique challenges. But in terms of just adapting to technology, it's tricky. Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, I mean, in your experience for you in a specific, when you are moving between technologies, what's the most difficult part for you? I mean, it could be learn the new software or decide which one is going to be, or talk with other people and make them understand what's your opinion regarding a specific technology or so. What's the most difficult part?
Honestly, I think the most challenging part is separating the things that I really want to do because I'm interested to the things that make the most sense to do. One example is I've gotten really passionate about blockchain technologies, and Ethereum and a few of the new stuff coming out in the cryptocurrency space, and I've been hunting for ways to integrate that new technology into our company. And the consistent challenge I'm having is, okay, I love it. I think it'd be really great. Now I need to find a way that it'll be practical, that it'll make sense for the company, that it'll make sense for the business, and that everyone else on the team could get as excited about it as me. There are, same with machine learning. It just did a deep dive into it and saw so many ways that we could integrate it and that it would be awesome and it'd be so powerful. But coming up with a practical application of that technology is almost always the most difficult thing for me. Because the new technologies are so cool. They're so fun to learn. And it's just finding, where's the right place to put this in, and is now the right time to do it. That's almost always the hardest part.
I see. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Justin. And Justin, we're about to wrap up. So I'd like to ask you, do you have any final words of wisdom for our audience about adapting and pivoting in tech that you would like to leave us with?
Yeah, and I think that one thing that's helped me and FundRx and a couple other companies and projects I've worked on is when there's a pivot or even an adaptation technology, it becomes easiest when you break it down into 3 chunks. And the example I'll give is a new business requirement comes in. I'll tie it back to the example I gave earlier with Handy and showing a map to give insight into the provider's location. Breaking down the requirement, which is, hey, we need a map to show our customers where the providers are, into, okay, well, what's the actual requirement? What's the intent, the business intent? Why are we doing this? And then what are the implementation requirements? So when breaking that down, it becomes clear, okay, well, the business requirement to show a map, but the intent is to give insight into where the provider is so the customers feel more comfortable. And the implementation requirements are, in this case, was Android specific. By breaking out those requirements into 3 separate things and tackling them independently, when the requirement changed from the implementation side and we needed to get it on iOS, it was much easier because we had separated out the implementation requirement from the business intent in the code. And the business intent was nicely isolated in its own little facade and its own module. It had no dependencies. And so when we swapped out the implementation requirements, it was easy, it was quick. And the same was true with the business requirements. And the initial requirement was to show a map, but the intent was to give people clarity onto the handy process. And so since we built it around the intent, when the requirement changed, it was no longer to show a map, but it was to show a timeline. That change was easy because we had isolated the intent from the business requirement and the implementation. I know that's kind of a longer conversation, but that would be kind of a quick suggestion. Just be when a new technology, a new pivot comes along, try and break it down into its fundamental components and then build around those rather than around the big picture. Because the peripherals tend to change more than the core. The business intent tends to last. The requirements tend to change.
All right, thank you, Justin. Hey, Justin, where can our viewers contact you? I understand that this is the website for FundRx and the Twitter handle for FundRx. It's right here at FundRx, right?
That's correct. And then you can contact me. My Twitter handle is JMMind. So JMMIND. Shoot me a tweet and I'll get back to you, or shoot me an email. Justin at FundRx.
Perfect. Absolutely. And also for the record, this interview is being recorded, so we'll upload it to a unique landing page where our viewers are going to be able to contact you as well through the website and through the landing page that we're creating for you. So folks, stay tuned, and in case you want to get a hold of Justin, you'll be able to do so right there on DojoLIVE's website, and of course on right here in the info that we have here, fundrx.com, and Twitter, FundRx, at FundRx. With that being said, Justin, the only thing left for me to do is simply send you a big warm thank you for having been here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely, it's our pleasure. And of course, Janet, as ever, you rock. And that's all for now, folks. And I want to remind you to keep an eye on future. Every Wednesday, we're going to be hosting a new DojoLIVE interview with experts like you in the technology world. So keep an eye for that. Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. So keep an eye for that. They're all also right there on DojoLIVE's website, which is dojo.nearsoft.com. And with that being said, again, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
You have a great afternoon, and keep up the great work, Justin. We'll be in touch.
Adios.
Bye. Adios.
Bye.